Hey class, welcome to week 9. We are just going to get right into it today because we have a lot to cover. But today we will be talking about research process. So where do you usually start? We talked about last class how you should have some questions to guide your learning. And once you have those questions, use them as a frame for the research that you start to do. So picking your topic is part of the research. You want to start with a topic that's narrow enough to show points of controversy, to show different opinions on the issue, to answer the questions that you have about that topic, because the likelihood is that if you have those questions about it, someone else will too. And then once you have those 1 to 3 inquiry questions, you can then go on to look for sources that help you answer those questions. So let's talk about annotations. This is going to be your next assignment for this class. And this is a mini assignment that leads into your A3. So it helps you build up to that assignment. And just because I said mini does not mean that it should be discounted. It's actually worth quite a bit of your grade, so I would suggest taking it very seriously. So with this assignment, they're called annotations, and you're going to be researching a debatable issue. So it does have to be debatable, meaning you can't choose something that there's no arguing about. Like, say, you want to argue that killing is bad. Well, most people would agree that killing is bad. So that's not debatable. Now, if you wanted to argue that hunting animals is bad, or that people shouldn't eat meat, like those are sorts of things that you can debate because there are two sides. There are people who agree that hunting animals is bad, and there are people who think that it's actually good for the environment. So, same with eating meat. There are people who think you should do it, and there are people who think you shouldn't. So those are the kind of issues that you want to be looking at as you're researching. Make sure that your research shows that there is complexity to these issues and that it represents the different perspectives and sides of the issue. And ultimately, I want you to be doing research first and reading about both sides of the issue and then deciding what side of this issue you're on so that you can support your position and your reasoning for that position. So what is an annotated bibliography? So this is a list of arranged alphabetically entries about different sources that you consult when writing a research paper. So essentially this is like a works cited page, but it's broken up. Your first set of annotations are going to be scholarly, and your second set are popular, and I'll explain what that means in just a moment, but they each consist of 3 parts. So there's the full MLA citation for the source, there's a summary of the key points, and then there's an analysis of whether or not that's a good source for you to use. Also, annotated bibliographies contain a critical preface, which is an introduction. You won't have to include this in yours, but just for reference so that you know that some of them do have this. So this is a really, really important set of websites for you to use while you're working on these. These are going to tell you all of the rules and guidelines for how you should be setting up these citations and how you should be structuring everything in these annotated bibliographies. So I do suggest that you use those. So let's talk about what you're going to be doing in these annotations. There are going to be 3 things that you're assessing. The first one is relevancy. So you're going to be asking yourself, does this source relate to my topic? Does it speak to my issue in this topic? And does it help answer my inquiry question? Is it giving me a new perspective on one of my stakeholder groups? And how is the source helping you and your research? And how does it talk to your other sources? These are all things that you're going to be considering. The other thing that we assess is the recency of the source. So when assessing the recency, we'd ask the following questions. How important is recency to my topic? And given my issue, is this source current enough to be useful? So is the information outdated? Is there new information that proves that this information on this source is inaccurate? If it's old but it's still accurate and there is no newer information on the issue, then that's fine and you can explain that in this annotated bibliography. But if it's old and it's outdated but it has some good parts that are still current, you can also explain that. You just want to make sure that you're not using sources that aren't relevant anymore based on the information that you're getting from them. So, and the last question is, will the source provide a current answer, to my inquiry question? The other thing we're going to be assessing, the last thing, is reliability. So things we ask ourselves when considering a source's reliability. We think about the author, the publisher, the date that it was published, whether there's any evidence of bias. So for instance, a lot of people talk about how ABC is, more of a Democratic news anchor, and then Fox is more of a Republican news anchor. So things like that, like if somebody, how much can you trust what this person is telling you based on their who they are and who they work for, and is there any evidence of bias? So I want you to consider the continuum of credibility, and this is listed here. So things like blogs you should be really skeptical of, because these are people posting on their personal pages. They don't need to verify the information they write on their website. But then there's things like high quality mainstream media like the newspaper and news magazines and things like that. You can be less skeptical of those. And if we move all the way down to much, much, much less skeptical, peer-reviewed scholarly journals and books from academic presses, these things have all typically been peer-reviewed. And we'll talk about what that means, but it makes it a much more reliable source. So anytime you're looking at a source, consider where it lands on this continuum. So here's an example of what an annotation will look like, and this is exactly what you'll be doing with your own sources. So this person lists the works cited information for their source. The author's last name has a hanging indent. It's left justified, and then we get into the summary portion here. So she's summarizing this information that the source talks about, and then here she analyzes whether it's relevant, recent, and reliable. So there's quite a bit to do and not a ton of space, so let me break that down even further for you. For every single source, we'll be talking about relevancy, recency, or currency, if that helps to think of it that way, and reliability. So keep in mind that some kind of bias is inevitable, but locate and use a variety of sources that represent several points of view so that you're making up for that inherent bias. And be prepared to share your decisions with the rest of the class. I might have us do some kind of discussion post based on why you chose what you chose. So the peer review process, you need at least 2 peer-reviewed sources for A3 and 2 of your 4 annotated bibliographies. So what is peer review? I've said this a lot and I still haven't explained it. And how do we identify a peer-reviewed paper? Well, peer-reviewed are scholarly sources, first of all. They go through a really rigorous process in order to be published, and they're usually written by researchers for researchers. You're not their audience necessarily, so a lot of the information may be dense, hard to understand, and written at the PhD level. And if you'd like, I did include the video on the peer review process if you just want to refresh that, but you should have already watched that. So these are examples of what peer review sources will look like when you look at them on the library's database. And I do highly suggest using the library's database because they have access to so many resources that Google Scholar won't necessarily have. So those are some examples there. And now let's talk about popular sources. 2 of your 4 sources need to be popular sources. These are often written for a general audience and they use language that's easy to understand. They hardly ever include citations for their sources and they're typically shorter. They're about 1 to 5 pages and they'll have pictures or colors. So these are some examples. There's, Discover Magazine, Newsweek, Time Magazine, and here's a comparison side by side. One thing I didn't mention is that academic sources are typically longer. They're either 10 or more pages, and if there are any images in them, they're typically graphs or charts or things that help explain the information that's being provided. So here are some examples of those. Here's a popular source here. These are just classic sources. So here are some of the expectations for your annotations, just to break it down a little further. You need 4 sources that are representative of your research. You can use more than 4, but you will only need to submit 4 for the annotated bibliography. And we'll submit this in 2 sections. The first 2 will be due on November 1st, and the second 2 will be due on November, I believe it was 11th. They should be from the library's database for your scholarly sources, and they should be reliable, relevant, and recent, and you should be able to explain why they are. Your sources should present different perspectives on the issue, help identify stakeholders in the issue, and help you understand the complexity of that issue. I do encourage you to have more than 4 sources. Usually my students that do really well on this assignment have more. So here are some important deadlines to keep in mind. November 1st, your first set of annotations will be due. So that's annotations 1 and 2. These are your scholarly annotations. So they must be peer-reviewed articles. And then November 8th is your final draft of annotations for numbers 3 and 4. And these are your popular media sources. Then November 16th, we'll have A3 draft submitted so that you can do a workshop on November 17th, and then you'll have a couple of days to make revisions, and the final A3 will be due on November 20th. So here's your homework. I won't take up any more of your time. You can read this on your own. But I do want you to note that the annotations assignment is now available on Canvas. So you can click into the assignment and read more about it, the description, the requirements. I would also suggest holding on to this PowerPoint so that you can review this information. And hopefully all of this makes sense to you guys. If any of it doesn't make sense or isn't totally clear, feel free to email me or post a question on the discussion post for this week. And also feel free to schedule any office hours visit with me this week. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. I will catch you next week.